Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. 3 knocks on my cabin door at 2:17 a.m., and I live 40 miles from the nearest neighbor. The sound cut through the Alaskan wilderness like a scream, deliberate and patient. When I peered through the frosted window, nothing but endless white stretched beyond my porch light's weak glow. But there, pressed into the snow, were boot prints leading to my door, and none leading away. What I'm about to tell you happened last winter in the Denali backcountry, and it changed everything I thought I knew about flying in Alaska. See, every bush pilot knows the weather rules, the navigation protocols, the weight restrictions. But there are other rules, older rules, rules that old-timers whisper about in hangar corners, rules that don't make it into any manual, rules that might just save your life if you're smart enough to listen. Story begins now. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been flying Alaska's bush country for 8 years. Started right after my discharge from the Air Force, trading the structured skies of military aviation for the wild freedom of the last frontier. Most people think bush flying is about weather and navigation. They're wrong. Dead wrong. The old-timer who sold me my Cessna 180 was named Earl Hutchins, 73 years old, hands like gnarled spruce branches, eyes the color of winter ice. Earl had been flying these mountains since before statehood, back when Alaska was still a territory and maps were more suggestion than fact. "Son," he said, counting my cash with those weathered fingers, "this bird will keep you alive if you remember 3 things. He paused, looking out at the Chugach Mountains. "First, never fly alone to Cache Creek on the 3rd Thursday of any month. Second, if you see a cabin with smoke coming from the chimney but no tracks in the snow leading to it, turn around immediately. And third," his voice dropped to barely a whisper, "if someone radios you from Grid Square Echo 77, don't respond. Not ever." I laughed, nervous laughter, the kind you make when something doesn't sit right in your gut. "Come on, Earl. What kind of rules are those?" Earl's expression didn't change. He handed me the keys but held on to them for a moment longer than necessary. "The kind that keep you breathing, boy. The kind my daddy taught me, and his daddy taught him. These mountains, they got their own logic, their own laws." 3 days later, Earl Hutchins was found dead in his cabin. "Natural causes," the coroner said. "Heart attack." But the strange thing was, he was found sitting in his chair, staring out the window with the aviation chart spread across his lap. Grid Square Echo 77 was circled in red ink over and over again until the paper had torn through. Winter came early that year, settling over Alaska like a heavy blanket by mid-October. I'd been making good money running supplies to remote cabins, medical emergencies, the usual bush pilot work. Every flight was routine, until I started noticing the pattern. It began with small things. Radio chatter that didn't quite make sense. Conversations between pilots that seemed to reference locations that didn't exist on any chart I had. Coordinates that led to empty wilderness when I looked them up. Then there was the incident with Mike Patterson. Veteran pilot, 20 years experience, flew a Super Cub like it was an extension of his own body. Mike was hauling supplies to a hunting camp near Talkeetna when he radioed in with coordinates that made my blood run cold. "Anchorage Control, this is November 27 Charlie. Papa, requesting permission to land at the airstrip in Grid Square Echo 77. Over." The silence on the radio stretched for almost a full minute. When the controller finally responded, his voice was strained. "Charlie Papa, we show no registered airstrip at those coordinates. Please verify your position." "Negative, Control. I can see the runway clear as day." There's even a windsock. Someone's waving me in from the ground. Mike's voice was calm, professional, but there was something underneath it. Something that made the hair on my neck stand up. That was the last anyone heard from Mike Patterson. Search and rescue found his Super Cub 3 days later, crashed into a stand of black spruce about 50 miles from his last reported position. The wreckage was strange. The plane had hit the trees nose first, but Mike's body was found in the pilot's seat, still strapped in, staring straight ahead with his eyes wide open. The expression on his face, well, the rescue team leader said it looked like Mike had seen something wonderful and terrible at the same time. But here's the thing that kept me awake at night. Grid Square Echo 77 was exactly where they found the wreckage. 2 months after Mike's accident, I was flying a routine cargo run to a remote mining operation near Fairbanks. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, unlimited visibility, barely a whisper of wind. The kind of flying conditions that make you remember why you fell in love with aviation in the first place. I was cruising at 8,500 feet, humming along with the engine's steady rhythm, when my radio crackled to life. Any aircraft, this is November 40 Whiskey Delta requesting immediate assistance. We have an emergency situation at the airstrip in Grid Square Echo 77. Repeat, emergency at Echo 77. My hands froze on the controls. Earl's warning echoed in my memory like a prayer. If someone radios you from Grid Square Echo 77, don't respond. Not ever. But this was an emergency call. Someone needed help. Everything in my pilot training screamed at me to respond, to render assistance. It's what we do. It's who we are. The voice came again, clearer this time. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is November 40 Whiskey Delta. We have injured passengers on board, requesting immediate medical assistance at Echo 77. I reached for the radio mic, then stopped. Something about the voice bothered me. It was too calm for a real emergency, too composed. When pilots are in genuine distress, you can hear it in their voice. Fear, urgency, the edge of panic creeping in. This voice sounded like someone reading lines from a script, but there was something else. The cadence, the slight pause between words. It sounded familiar, terrifyingly familiar. I checked my sectional chart. Grid Square Echo 77 was about 30 miles to my northeast. Wild country, nothing but mountains and forest. According to my charts, there was no airstrip there, no registered landing area of any kind, but Mike Patterson had seen one. Mike Patterson had tried to land there. The radio crackled again. Any aircraft monitoring this frequency, please respond. We have children on board. Repeat, children on board requiring immediate medical assistance. The word children hit me like a physical blow. Every instinct, every fiber of human decency demanded that I turn toward those coordinates and render assistance. But Earl's voice whispered in my memory, and Mike Patterson's face stared at me from the newspaper photo on my dashboard. I made a decision that still haunts me. I reached over and turned off my radio, but turning off the radio didn't stop the voices. They came through the static, faint but unmistakable. Not just Mike's voice now, but others. Voices I recognized from the old accident reports, from the names whispered in hangar corners. William Hutchins, his voice crackling through the decades, still calling for help from Echo 77. Sarah Mitchell, who'd crashed there in 1987, her voice joining the chorus. Tom Bradley from the 92 incident. All of them calling out from that cursed grid square, their voices layered like an unholy choir. Jake Morrison. The voice that spoke my name wasn't coming through the radio at all. It was inside my cockpit, right beside me. I turned to look at the co-pilot seat, and for just a moment, just a heartbeat, I saw Earl Hutchins sitting there, his weathered face pale as winter snow. "Don't listen to them, boy," Earl's ghostly voice whispered. They ain't who they used to be. That place, it changes people, uses them, makes them into something else. I blinked, and the seat was empty again. But the temperature in the cockpit had dropped 20 degrees, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The voices on the radio grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just calling for help anymore. They were calling my name specifically. Jake Morrison, November 8577, Quebec. We can see you from here. You're cleared for landing at Echo 77. Beautiful approach, Jake. Just follow our lights. That's when I made a mistake. Despite every warning, despite Earl's ghost sitting beside me, despite the unnatural cold in my cockpit, I looked northeast toward Grid Square Echo 77, and what I saw made my soul try to crawl out through my skin. There, carved into the wilderness like a wound in the earth, was an airstrip. It glowed with a soft, phosphorescent light that had nothing to do with electricity or fire. The runway was perfect, too perfect, like something out of a dream. Approach lights twinkled in neat rows, leading to a threshold that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. And there, standing beside what looked like a windsock, was a figure waving me in. Even from 30 miles away, I could see him clearly. Too clearly. He wore a pilot's uniform from decades past, and when he turned his face toward my aircraft, I saw it was William Hutchins, Earl's father. The first pilot to crash at Echo 77. But William had been dead for 70 years. The impossible airstrip beckoned, and I felt my hands begin to turn the yoke toward those coordinates. The voices on the radio weren't threatening now. They were welcoming, warm, inviting me home to a place I'd never been, but somehow remembered. The runway lights pulsed in perfect synchronization with my heartbeat, and I understood with crystal clarity that all I had to do was land there, and all my questions would be answered. All my fears would end. The engine note changed as I began my descent toward Echo 77. "Jake!" Earl's voice exploded through the cockpit, no longer a whisper, but a shout of desperate warning. "It ain't real. The runway ain't real. You're heading straight for a mountain." I snapped back to reality, like a rubber band released. The glowing airstrip vanished, replaced by the stark reality of a granite cliff face rushing toward my windscreen at 120 miles per hour. I pulled back hard on the yoke, felt the G-forces press me into my seat as my Cessna clawed for altitude. The mountain peak passed beneath me with maybe 50 feet to spare. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the controls. The radio had gone silent. No more emergency calls, no more voices from the dead, nothing but the normal chatter of commercial traffic and flight following. But when I looked at my fuel gauges, my blood ran cold. I'd been flying toward Echo 77 for 23 minutes. 23 minutes of descent that should have put me into that mountain. But according to my instruments, I'd been maintaining level flight the entire time. According to my GPS, I'd never deviated from my original course. But I knew better. I'd felt the descent, felt the pull of that impossible runway. Time and space had folded somehow, allowing me to fly toward death while never actually leaving the safety of my planned route. That's when I understood the true horror of Echo 77. It wasn't just a place where pilots crashed. It was a place that existed outside normal reality. A place that could reach out and pluck aircraft from the sky without ever touching them. The pilots who died there hadn't crashed because they'd been lured off course. They'd crashed because they'd been pulled into a place where the laws of physics meant nothing, where death wore the mask of salvation. And now, their voices had become part of the lure, calling to other pilots, adding their testimonies to the siren song that drew aircraft to that cursed grid square. I flew the rest of the way to Fairbanks in complete radio silence, my hands white-knuckled on the yoke, my eyes fixed straight ahead. But I could feel it behind me, Echo 77, watching, waiting, patient as the mountains themselves. When I finally landed at Fairbanks International, the ground crew chief walked over to my aircraft. "You okay, Morrison? You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed at the irony. Instead, I just nodded and began my post-flight inspection. But as I walked around my Cessna, checking control surfaces and tie-down points, I found something that made my knees buckle. There, carved into the aluminum skin of my starboard wing, were numbers. GPS coordinates. The exact coordinates for Grid Square Echo 77, etched as if by an invisible hand. The numbers hadn't been there during my pre-flight inspection. After finding those coordinates carved into my wing, I became obsessed, not with flying anymore. That part of me died somewhere over Echo 77. No, I became obsessed with understanding what I was dealing with. I spent the next 3 weeks grounded, diving deep into archives that most people never knew existed. The Anchorage Flight Service station had boxes of old incident reports dating back to territorial days. The Alaska State Troopers had files on missing aircraft that read like ghost stories. The National Transportation Safety Board had a locked cabinet full of cases they'd marked "Investigation suspended pending further information." Every single file pointed back to the same coordinates. But it was at the University of Alaska's Anthropology Department that I found the piece that made everything click into place. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in indigenous folklore, had spent decades documenting oral histories from Alaska Native communities. When I showed her the coordinates for Echo 77, her face went pale. "You shouldn't know about that place," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Tanana people call it the Hungry Sky. It's been forbidden territory for over 300 years. She pulled out a thick folder filled with handwritten notes and old photographs. According to the tribal elders, that area has always been wrong. Long before white settlers, before aircraft, before modern technology. Their ancestors told stories of warriors who would disappear while hunting in that region. They'd be found days later, sometimes weeks, always in the same condition. Eyes wide open, staring at something wonderful and terrible." My skin crawled as she continued. "The tribal stories speak of a presence that feeds on the last moments of life, specifically the moment when hope turns to despair. It doesn't just kill its victims. It sustains itself on their final realization that rescue isn't coming, that they're going to die alone in the wilderness." Dr. Chen showed me a map drawn on caribou hide, probably 2 centuries old. The area we now call Grid Square Echo 77 was marked with symbols that made my eyes water to look at them directly. The Tanana people have a word for it, Ayakthul. Roughly translated, it means the place that wears false faces. "But why pilots?" I asked. "Why aviation?" "Think about it," she replied. "What profession is built entirely on hope turning to despair? Every pilot who flies into remote areas does so knowing they might not make it back. Every emergency landing, every equipment failure, every moment of crisis. It's the perfect emotional cocktail for something that feeds on that specific transition from hope to hopelessness." She paused, studying my face. "But there's something else. The elders say that Ayakthul doesn't just consume its victims. It learns from them, adapts, takes their knowledge, their voices, their memories, and uses them to lure others." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw William Hutchins standing beside that impossible runway, waving me in with a smile that was too knowing. I thought about the voices on the radio, how they'd known my name, my tail number, exactly what to say to make me want to help. But I also thought about Earl Hutchins' ghost, how he'd appeared just in time to save my life. If Echo 77 was collecting the dead, why had Earl tried to warn me away? The answer came to me at 3:17 a.m., exactly 1 hour after the mysterious knocks that had started this whole nightmare. I sat up in bed, sweat cooling on my skin, and reached for my phone. But instead of calling anyone, I found myself opening the voice recording app. "Testing, testing," I said into the microphone, then played it back. My voice sounded normal, human, alive. But when I played the recording again, something else was there. A subtle echo, a harmonic that shouldn't exist. And beneath my own voice, almost inaudible, I could hear them. The voices of Echo 77 whispering my name. The entity wasn't just learning from the pilots it consumed. It was learning from the living ones, too. Every radio transmission, every emergency call, every moment of fear or doubt. It was cataloging our voices, our speech patterns, our emotional responses, building a library of human sounds to better mimic us. But Earl had broken free somehow. In death, he'd found the strength to resist the pull of Echo 77, to warn others instead of luring them, which meant the entity wasn't infallible. It could be fought, it could be escaped. That thought should have comforted me. Instead, it filled me with a terror so profound I couldn't breathe. Because if Earl had escaped the entity's control, if he was trying to warn people away from Echo 77, then why had I started hearing those voices in my own recordings? I stumbled to my bathroom mirror and stared at my reflection. I looked the same brown hair, same hazel eyes, same scar on my chin from a childhood accident. But when I smiled, something was wrong. The expression didn't feel like mine. It felt rehearsed, artificial, like I was copying someone else's idea of what happiness should look like. "Jake Morrison," I said to my reflection, and my voice sounded exactly like it should. But there, in the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something else in the mirror. A shadow that moved independently of my body, a presence that occupied the same space as my reflection, but wasn't quite aligned with it. I turned around quickly, but nothing was there. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was normal again. But on the mirror's surface, written in what looked like condensation but couldn't have been, were coordinates. The coordinates for Grid Square Echo 77, and they were written in my own handwriting. I spent the next few days avoiding mirrors, avoiding reflective surfaces of any kind, but I couldn't avoid the truth that was becoming clearer with each passing hour. My encounter with Echo 77 hadn't ended when I flew away from those phantom runway lights. It had just begun. The entity wasn't just learning from me. It was slowly becoming me, replacing me piece by piece, memory by memory, until nothing of the real Jake Morrison would remain. And then, wearing my face and speaking with my voice, it would call other pilots to their doom. The thought drove me to desperate measures. I contacted every pilot I knew, sending them anonymous warnings about Echo 77, sharing Earl's rules, begging them to spread the word. But when I read back my own messages, I realized with growing horror that I wasn't warning them away from the cursed coordinates. I was giving them detailed directions on how to get there. The entity was using me as a vector, a carrier to spread its influence beyond the confines of Grid Square Echo 77. Every pilot I warned would receive the coordinates, would become curious, would eventually find themselves drawn to investigate, and I was the one providing the map to their destruction. That's when I made the hardest decision of my life. I had to disappear, not just leave Alaska. I had to erase Jake Morrison entirely before the entity could finish its work. Before I became just another voice calling pilots to their deaths. But as I packed my few belongings, preparing to abandon my identity and start over somewhere far from Alaska's skies, I found a note in my flight bag. Written in my own handwriting, but I had no memory of writing it. The hungry sky follows wherever pilots dream of flying. Distance means nothing. Time means nothing. You carry us with you now, Jake Morrison. Every airport you visit, every runway you see, every pilot you meet. We are there, waiting, growing stronger. At the bottom of the note were 17 signatures, the names of every pilot who had died at Echo 77, written in their own handwriting. And at the very bottom, in fresh ink, was my own signature. The signature was mine, but I hadn't written it. The handwriting was perfect, down to the slight leftward slant I'd developed after breaking my right wrist in flight school. But I had no memory of signing anything. That's when the full horror of my situation became clear. The entity from Echo 77 hadn't just been learning from me during our encounter. It had been uploading itself into my consciousness, one neuron at a time. I wasn't becoming possessed in any traditional sense. I was becoming a host, a living extension of something that existed outside normal space and time. And it was almost finished with the process. I could feel it now, moving through my thoughts like a virus through a computer system, rewriting my memories, adjusting my perceptions, preparing to take full control. But there were still gaps in its work, moments where the real Jake Morrison could surface and understand what was happening. This story, these words you're reading, they might be the last true thoughts I'll ever have. The entity made one mistake, though. In its eagerness to complete the transfer, it showed me its true plan. Echo 77 was never the end point. It was just the beginning, a beachhead in our reality, a foothold from which to launch a much larger invasion. Every pilot who died there didn't just become a voice in the choir. They became a seed, a point of infection that could manifest anywhere in the world where aircraft operated. The entity was building a network, using human consciousness as nodes in a vast supernatural communication system, and I was about to become its newest broadcaster. The worst part? I don't think it's malevolent in any human sense. It doesn't hate us or want to cause suffering. We're just food, energy sources. The way it feeds on the transition from hope to despair is as natural to it as breathing is to us. We might as well hate a shark for eating fish or a tornado for destroying houses. But understanding its nature doesn't make it any less dangerous. If anything, it makes it more terrifying. Because how do you fight something that doesn't even recognize you as a sentient being? How do you reason with the force of nature that sees your entire species as nothing more than a renewable resource? You can't. All you can do is run, hide, and hope it doesn't notice you. But I can't run anymore. The infection has progressed too far. I can feel my personality dissolving, replaced by something alien and hungry. In a few hours, maybe less, Jake Morrison will cease to exist in any meaningful way. The thing wearing my face will walk out of this cabin, board the next flight to wherever pilots gather and begin spreading the contagion. Unless there is one option, one final act of defiance that might, just might, prevent the entity from using me as its vector. It's not a pleasant option, and it certainly isn't heroic, but it might be necessary. I have Earl's old service revolver, found it in his estate sale, along with a note explaining its significance. Some things are worse than death, the note read. Sometimes, dying is the most loving thing you can do for the people you're trying to protect. But even now, as I write these words, I can feel the entity fighting back. It's showing me visions of all the good I could do, all the pilots I could save by guiding them to the eternal peace of Echo 77. It's making me remember the joy of flight, the freedom of the open sky, the brotherhood of aviators who look out for one another. It's making suicide seem selfish, cowardly, unnecessary. And maybe it is. Maybe I'm just a scared pilot who let his imagination run away with him. Maybe there's no supernatural entity, no otherworldly threat, no infection spreading through my consciousness. Maybe I'm just losing my mind, and in a few days I'll look back on this moment and laugh at how foolish I was. But I can't take that chance. Not when the lives of every pilot in the world might depend on my decision. Not when the alternative is becoming a recruitment tool for something that feeds on human suffering. So I'm going to make a choice. The hardest choice of my life. I'm going to trust Earl's warning. I'm going to trust my own experience. I'm going to trust the evidence of my own senses, even if it means accepting a reality that's too strange and terrible to comprehend. And I'm going to make sure that Jake Morrison dies as himself, not as a puppet of the hungry sky. If you're reading this, it means my story somehow survived. Maybe someone found this cabin, found these notes, decided to share them with the world. Maybe the entity failed to suppress the truth this time. Or maybe this is all part of its plan. Maybe it wanted this story to spread, wanted you to read these coordinates, wanted you to become curious about Grid Square Echo 77. There's no way to know for certain. That's the most insidious thing about an enemy that operates outside the laws of reality. You can never be sure what's real and what's manipulation. All I can do is leave you with Earl's warning, passed down through 3 generations of pilots who learned too late that some places in this world operate by different rules. Never fly alone to Cache Creek on the 3rd Thursday of any month. If you see a cabin with smoke coming from the chimney but no tracks in the snow leading to it, turn around immediately. And if someone radios you from Grid Square Echo 77, don't respond. Not ever. These aren't just superstitions. They're survival instructions for a war most people don't even know is being fought. The war between our reality and something that wants to devour it. One soul at a time. That was 6 months ago. I've since sold my Cessna and moved to Montana, far from Alaska's endless skies and the thing that hunts in Grid Square Echo 77. But before I left, I found Earl's old logbook in his estate sale. Hidden in the back pages was a list of names. 17 names, including his father's, including Mike Patterson's. At the bottom of the list, in Earl's shaky handwriting, were 2 more entries. My name and yours. Because, you see, the thing that calls from Echo 77 isn't just hunting pilots anymore. It's adapting, evolving, learning new ways to lure people into its trap. Radio calls have become phone calls, emergency frequencies have become social media posts, and flight plans have become GPS coordinates sent to your phone at 2:17 a.m. So here's my warning to you. If you ever find yourself in Alaska, if you ever hear a call for help from Grid Square Echo 77, if someone tries to guide you to coordinates that don't exist on any map, remember Earl Hutchins. Remember Mike Patterson. Remember the 17 pilots who thought they were rendering assistance to someone in need. And remember that some rules exist for reasons we're not meant to understand. The Alaska bush flying rules aren't just about weather and navigation. They're about survival. They're about recognizing that some places in this world operate by different laws, older laws, laws that don't care about your good intentions or your desire to help. 3 knocks at 2:17 a.m. That's how it starts. That's how it's always started. The question is, when you hear those knocks, will you remember my warning? Will you remember Earl's rules? Or will you become the 18th name on the list? The choice is yours. What do you think was really calling from Grid Square Echo 77? Have you ever experienced something similar in remote areas? Share your theories and experiences in the comments below. And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, subscribe for more tales from Alaska's most dangerous skies. Sweet dreams. And remember, not all emergency calls are what they seem. Story number 2. They say every nurse has that one shift that changes them forever. Mine happened 3 weeks ago at Riverside Psychiatric Hospital in Portland, Maine. And I still count the patients in my sleep. 27. Always 27. Even though our ward only has 26 beds. Before I tell you what happened, I need you to understand something. When you work psych, you develop a 6th sense. You know when a patient's about to have an episode before they do. You feel the air change when something's wrong, and you never, ever ignore the numbers. So if you're listening to this alone, maybe check your room first. Count the corners. Count the shadows. Because once you know what to look for, you can't unsee it. The story begins now. I'd been working at Riverside for 6 years. Not the oldest psychiatric facility in Maine, but old enough that the walls had stories. Stories they whispered through the heating vents at night. The building used to be a tuberculosis sanatorium back in the 1920s. They converted it in '73, but if you knew where to look, you could still find the scratch marks from the old days. Deep grooves in places no patient could reach now. My name's Sarah Chen, and I was the charge nurse for Wing C, the long-term residential unit. 26 beds, all singles. We kept it that way after the incident in '09, but that's not important right now. What matters is the morning count. Every shift starts the same way. You get report from the night nurse, check the med cart, and then you count. Physical eyes on every patient, not just checking the census sheet. You walk the halls, peek through the safety windows, and you count. 1 through 26. That Tuesday morning, November 12th, started like any other. Jessica. The night nurse looked tired. More tired than usual. She kept rubbing her eyes, blinking hard like she was trying to focus. "Rough night?" I asked, signing in on the tablet. She paused, too long. "Sarah, did we get a new admission? I could have sworn. No admission scheduled till Thursday. Why?" Jessica shook her head. "Nothing. I kept counting 27 during rounds, but the census says 26. I'm probably just tired." She left quickly after that. Didn't even finish her coffee. I should have paid attention to that, should have asked more questions. But morning med pass was coming up, and Mr. Jameson in room 12 had been refusing his antipsychotics for 2 days. I had bigger concerns, or so I thought. I started my count at 7:15 a.m. Room 1, Mrs. Patterson sitting by her window, humming that same tune she'd been humming for 3 years. Room 2, empty, scheduled for deep clean. Room 3, Tommy, 19 years old, admitted after his 3rd suicide attempt. Asleep, breathing steady, I made my way down the hall, marking each patient on my clipboard. The fluorescent lights hummed above, that specific frequency that gets into your bones after a while. Room after room, face after face. Some patients waved, others didn't acknowledge me at all. Room 14, Mr. Jameson, pacing as expected. Room 15, David, our youngest at 18, drawing in his notebook. Room 16, Mrs. Gonzalez praying with her rosary, though we'd removed the beads for safety. Everything normal. Everything accounted for. Room 24, Alan, staring at the wall like always. Room 25, Jennifer, reorganizing her belongings for the 100th time. Room 26, Marcus, our newest admission, still adjusting to the routine. 25 patients, 1 empty room. I counted again, 25. But as I turned to head back to the nurse's station, I saw him. Room 11, standing at the window of the door, face pressed against the safety glass, pale, thin, hospital gown hanging loose on his frame. Room 11 had been empty for a month. I checked my clipboard, no admission for room 11. I looked back up, and he was gone. Just the empty room. Bed stripped, no personal belongings. I opened the door, slowly. The room smelled different. Not the usual antiseptic smell, but something older, like dust and copper. The morning sun came through the barred window, casting shadows that seemed too long, too dark for 7:30 a.m. "Sarah?" I jumped. Dr. Rodriguez stood in the doorway, coffee in hand. "Room 11's empty, right?" I asked. He nodded. "Has been since Mr. Carver was discharged. Why?" I wanted to tell him. Wanted to say I'd seen someone. But you don't last 6 years in psych by seeing things that aren't there. That's what our patients do. Not us. Just thought I saw something, trick of the light. But at 11:11 a.m., everything changed. Med pass went smooth. Too smooth, actually. Mr. Jameson took his pills without argument. Jennifer didn't ask for extras. Even Alan, who usually required coaxing, swallowed his medication without protest. The morning group therapy session was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the common room. I was documenting at the nurse's station when Lisa, one of our mental health technicians, came rushing over. "Sarah, we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "I can't get an accurate count for group. I keep getting 27. My pen stopped moving. 27? I know we only have 26 beds, and room 2 is empty, so it should be 25, but... She lowered her voice. "There's someone extra. I can't figure out who." I followed her to the common room. The patients sat in their usual circle, some engaged, others lost in their own worlds. I started counting. Tommy, Mrs. Patterson, David, Jennifer. I went around the circle. 25, I counted again. 25. "See?" I told Lisa. 25. But she was pale, pointing to the corner of the room. "Then who's that?" I looked where she pointed. Empty corner, just the old radiator and peeling paint. "Lisa, there's no one there." She blinked hard, rubbed her eyes. I swear I saw... You've been pulling doubles. When's the last time you had a real break?" But even as I said it, something felt wrong. The room felt crowded, like there wasn't enough air for everyone present. And the patients, they kept glancing at that empty corner. Quick looks, like they were checking if something was still there. Mrs. Patterson's humming grew louder. That same tune, but now I recognized it. It was a lullaby, Rock-a-Bye Baby, but the melody was wrong, minor key where it should be major. It made my skin crawl. At 10:47, David suddenly stood up from the circle. "I need to go back to my room." "David, group isn't over, please." His voice cracked. "Before it happens again." "Before what happens?" He looked at the clock on the wall. 10:48. The count. It happens at 11:11. Every day now. For the past week. You'll see. You'll all see. Dr. Rodriguez tried to calm him, but David was insistent. Other patients started getting agitated. Mrs. Gonzalez clutched her imaginary rosary tighter. Alan, who never spoke, whispered something I couldn't quite hear. At 10:55, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had opened a freezer door. Our breath came out in small puffs. "Maintenance issue," Dr. Rodriguez said, but his voice wasn't steady. "Sarah, call facilities." I went to the nurse's station. The phone was dead. Not unusual. Our phone system was ancient, but the computer was also frozen. The clock on the screen stuck at 11:10. I looked at my watch, 11:09. The hallway lights flickered. Once, twice. Then I heard Lisa scream. I ran back to the common room. Everyone was standing now, backed against the walls. In the center of their abandoned circle of chairs, someone sat. Pale, thin. Hospital gown from a different era. The kind we stopped using in the 90s. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I recognized him. Peter Hoffman, patient from 94. I'd seen his file during my orientation. Died by suicide in room 11. They found him at 11:11 a.m. The clock on the wall ticked to 11:11, and Peter Hoffman looked directly at me. His mouth moved. No sound, but I could read his lips. Count again. I counted the room. 25 patients, plus Peter, 26. But then I saw another figure in the corner. Then another by the window. More pale forms in outdated hospital gowns. Previous patients. All of them from the old files. All of them died here, 27, 28, 29. They kept appearing. And our living patients, they could all see them too. The moment passed at 11:12. Like a soap bubble popping, the extra figures vanished. The temperature returned to normal. The lights stopped flickering. But the damage was done. 3 patients had seizures. Mrs. Patterson wouldn't stop screaming. David locked himself in the bathroom and refused to come out for 2 hours. We called a code gray, all hands to the unit. But what could we tell them? That we'd all experienced a mass hallucination. Dr. Rodriguez pulled me aside after we'd stabilized everyone. My office. Now. His office was in the basement, part of the original building. The walls were brick, painted over so many times you could see the layers where the paint had chipped. He closed the door and went straight to an old filing cabinet, the kind that hadn't been digitized yet. Sarah, what I'm about to show you stays between us. Understood? I nodded. He pulled out a folder marked Incident Reports, 1994, and handed it to me. Page 12. I flipped through. It was a report from November 12, 1994. 30 years ago to the day. The charge nurse, Margaret Fuller, had written, multiple staff reports seeing additional patients during 11:11 a.m. count. Census shows 26, but staff consistently count 27. 3 patients claim to see the old ones returning, recommending immediate psychiatric evaluation for affected staff. Keep reading, Dr. Rodriguez said. The next report was from November 13, 1994. Count discrepancy continues. Now seeing 28 to 30 patients at 11:11 a.m. Patients increasingly agitated. Mr. Peter Hoffman, extremely distressed, claims they want to trade places, placed on 1-to-1 observation. November 14, 1994. Peter Hoffman found deceased in room 11 at 11:11 a.m. Suicide by hanging. Note found, 27 must become 26. I'm sorry. 3 staff members resigned effective immediately. I looked up at Dr. Rodriguez. This has happened before. Every 30 years, he said quietly. 1964, 1994, and now 2024. Always in November. Always building up to something on the 15th. That's in 3 days. I know. He pulled out another file. This is from 1964. The report was similar. Extra patients appearing at 11:11, staff resigning. And then, on November 15, 1964, a patient named Dorothy Mills was found dead in room 11. Same time, same message. 27 must become 26. What about 1934? I asked. The building was still a tuberculosis sanatorium then, but he showed me an old newspaper clipping. November 15, 1934. 27 patients died in a fire that started in, guess where? Room 11, at 11:11 a.m. I felt cold again, but this time it wasn't supernatural. It was the chill of understanding. Someone always dies, I said. To maintain the balance, 27 becomes 26. Unless we can figure out how to break the pattern. I thought about David's words. You'll all see. He knew. Somehow, our youngest patient knew. I need to talk to David, I said. Dr. Rodriguez nodded. Be careful, Sarah. The last nurse who investigated this, she was Margaret Fuller. She resigned on November 16, 1994. Never worked in healthcare again. I tracked her down 5 years ago. She's in a psychiatric facility herself now. Won't stop counting to 27. I found David in the art therapy room. he was drawing. The same figure over and over. A tall, thin man in an old-fashioned hospital gown. "You've seen him before," I said. It wasn't a question. David didn't look up. "Since I got here, he stands in the corner of my room at night. Counts, 1 through 27, over and over." "Why 27? "That's how many died in the fire. In 1934. They never left. They're stuck here in the in-between. Every 30 years they get stronger. Strong enough to be seen. Strong enough to..." He finally looked at me. "To trade places." Trade places? One of us for one of them. That's what Peter Hoffman understood. That's what Dorothy Mills understood. Someone living has to take the place of someone dead, to maintain the balance, to keep the rest of us safe. "That's not going to happen," I said firmly. David smiled. It was the saddest smile I'd ever seen on someone so young. "It's already started, haven't you noticed? We're all counting to 27 now, even when we try not to. 27 steps to the medication room, 27 tiles from the nurse's station to room 11, 27 seconds between the light flickers." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, but I'd been counting too, without realizing it. 27, always 27. November 13th, 2 days until the pattern would complete. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Peter Hoffman's face. Heard the counting. 1 through 27, over and over. The morning shift was chaos. Patients were refusing to leave their rooms. Staff were calling in sick. 3 nurses, 2 technicians. Those who showed up looked haggard. We were all counting now, compulsively. Steps, breaths, heartbeats. At 11:11 a.m., it was worse than the day before. They didn't just appear, they interacted. I watched in horror as one of the pale figures, a woman in a 1960s-style hospital gown, reached out and touched Mrs. Patterson. The old woman's humming stopped mid-note. Her eyes went wide, and for a moment, just a moment, Mrs. Patterson flickered, like a TV with bad reception. There and not there. "No!" I grabbed Mrs. Patterson's arm, pulled her away. She solidified, but her skin was cold, so cold. The pale figures were everywhere now, walking the halls, sitting in the common areas, standing in the corners of rooms, and our patients, our living patients, were fading, becoming translucent around the edges. Dr. Rodriguez called an emergency meeting. "We're evacuating the unit," he announced, "transferring all patients to Wing A." "You can't," David said from the doorway. He wasn't supposed to be there, but no one had the energy to send him back. "It won't matter. The building is marked. We're all marked. 27. "Then what do you suggest?" Dr. Rodriguez snapped. The stress was getting to him too. David looked at me. "Someone has to choose. Like Peter did, like Dorothy did. Someone has to choose to be the 27th. To take their place among the old ones. Or," he paused, "or they'll take all of us." The room erupted in arguments, ethical violations, legal ramifications, but I stayed quiet, because I'd been thinking the same thing. That night, I went through the old records again, really dug deep, and I found something everyone had missed. The fire in 1934, it wasn't an accident. A nurse named Elizabeth Hartley had said it. She'd been trying to destroy something in room 11. Her journal, recovered from the ruins, had one entry that survived. "The room is a door. Has always been a door. The tuberculosis patients knew. They drew it on the walls. 27 circles, connected by lines. A pattern, a summoning. It must be destroyed before they come through completely." I went to room 11 at 3 a.m., the middle of the night when the veil should be thinnest. I brought a blacklight I'd borrowed from maintenance. Under the UV light, the walls told a different story. Drawings, hundreds of them, hidden under layers of paint. circles connected by lines just like Elizabeth had described. But more than that, names, dates, a record of everyone who'd died in this room. Not just the suicides, the tuberculosis patients, the fire victims, others, so many others. And at the center of it all, drawn in what looked like blood, was a symbol I'd never seen before, except I had. Mrs. Patterson had been drawing it, over and over in her art therapy. David had it in his sketches. Even Alan, who never participated in activities, had scratched it into the paint by his bed. They were all drawing the same symbol. November 14th. One day left. The 11:11 a.m. event lasted a full hour. The living and the dead mingled freely. I couldn't tell them apart anymore without checking my census sheet. Some of our patients had stopped eating, stopped talking. They just stood at their windows, staring at room 11. Lisa quit on the spot. Just walked out at 12:11, didn't even clock out. 2 more nurses followed. Dr. Rodriguez was on the phone with the state, trying to get emergency intervention. But what could he tell them that wouldn't sound insane? I found David in room 11. He wasn't supposed to be able to get in. We'd locked it. But there he was, standing in the center of the room, tracing the hidden symbol on the wall with his finger. "You figured it out," he said, without turning around. "The room isn't just a room, it's a threshold, a counting house. 27 souls died here in 1934, all at once. The fire, the smoke, they died counting each other, counting down. And now they can't stop. Why 27? Because that's the number that breaks the pattern. In numerology, in the old beliefs, 27 is transformation, death and rebirth, the cycle completing. But the cycle was broken. They died before they could complete it. So every 30 years they try again, try to finish the count, by taking one of us." David turned to face me. In the dim light, he looked older, ancient even. "No," he said, "by taking all of us, one by one, until 27 becomes 27 again. The living replacing the dead, the cycle completing, unless someone volunteers, chooses to be the bridge, to complete their count." He nodded. "Peter figured it out too late. He thought his death would end it. But he just delayed it. Dorothy too. They became part of the pattern instead of breaking it." "Then how do we break it?" David smiled that sad smile again. "Someone has to count backwards, from 27 to 0, while standing in the center of the pattern at 11:11, undoing what was done. But, whoever does it becomes the doorkeeper, forever, neither living nor dead, counting eternally to keep the threshold closed." I looked at the hidden symbols on the walls, at this 18-year-old kid who'd tried to kill himself 3 times, who'd been carrying this knowledge alone. "You were going to do it," I said. "Tomorrow. You were going to sacrifice yourself." "Who'd miss me?" he asked simply. "I'm already broken, already halfway gone. At least this way, my death means something." "No." The word came out harder than I intended. "We're going to find another way." But as I said it, we both heard it. The counting had started again. Not from us, from the walls themselves. Whispers in unison. 1, 2, 3. November 15th was coming, and the count would be complete. November 15th, 6 a.m. I hadn't left the hospital, neither had Dr. Rodriguez. The few staff who'd shown up looked like they were attending a funeral. Maybe they were. The patients were gathered in the hallway outside room 11, all 25 of them, standing in perfect silence, waiting. At 10 a.m., the pale figures started appearing. Not just at 11:11 anymore. They were bleeding through constantly now, the barrier weakening. At 10:30, Mrs. Patterson spoke for the first time in 3 years. clear as day. 27 must be 27. At 10:45, the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in, casting everything in that sickly green glow. At 11 o'clock, I made my choice. I went to room 11. David was already there, standing in the center of the pattern, but I pushed him aside. "Sarah, no, you're 18, I said. "You have a whole life ahead of you." "What life?" he asked. "I've tried to end it 3 times. And failed 3 times. Maybe that means something. Maybe you're meant to survive this." The counting from the walls grew louder. 10, 11, 12. Dr. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. "Sarah, what are you doing?" "My job," I said, "protecting my patients." The clock on the wall showed 11:10, 1 minute. The pale figures filled the room now. Peter Hoffman stood directly in front of me, Dorothy Mills to my right, Elizabeth Hartley to my left. All the souls who died in this room. Waiting, counting, 23, 24, 25. "There has to be another way," David pleaded. 26. And then I understood, really understood. The pattern wasn't about replacing the living with the dead. It was about completing the count they'd started. The count that had been interrupted by death. They weren't counting up to 27. They'd been counting down from it. 11:11. 27, I shouted, not to them, to the room itself, to the pattern. "The count is 27. The pale figures stopped, turned to look at me. "You died at 27, I continued, my voice stronger. "The count was already complete. You've been trying to finish something that was already finished. 27 souls. The transformation complete. The cycle closed." Peter Hoffman's mouth moved, but we never reached 0. "Because 0 isn't the end," David said suddenly, understanding. "It's the beginning, the reset. You've been counting in the wrong direction." I looked at the clock. Still 11:11. Time had stopped. "Count with me," I said to the pale figures. "Not up, down, 27 to 0, complete the cycle, set yourselves free." Together, we counted 27, 26, 25. With each number, a pale figure flickered. Not disappearing, but brightening, becoming more solid, more real. 20, 19, 18. The walls began to crack. Not physically, but something deeper. The pattern was unraveling. 10, 9, 8. Mrs. Patterson started humming again, but this time the lullaby was in the right key. Major, not minor, sweet, not sinister. 3, 2, 1. All the pale figures looked at me, waiting. 0, I whispered. The room exploded with light, not harsh but warm, like sunrise, and in that light I saw them clearly. Not pale figures, but people, whole people, smiling. Peter Hoffman nodded at me once, a thank you. And then they were gone, all of them. Not vanished, but released. The pattern on the walls faded, the symbol disappeared. Room 11 was just a room again. The clock ticked to 11:12. It's been 3 weeks now. Room 11 is still empty, but it's a different kind of empty, peaceful. We've had no incidents, no extra counts. The patients are recovering. David's been participating in therapy, really participating. He says he doesn't hear the counting anymore. Neither do I, except sometimes, late at night, when I'm doing my rounds, I count my steps, and I always get a different number. 23 to the medroom one night, 31 the next. The pattern is broken. The rigid count that had trapped us all is gone. But yesterday a new patient was admitted, an elderly man, transferred from a facility in Boston. As I was showing him to his room 11, actually, we'd finally opened it again. He stopped in the doorway. "Someone was counting," he said. "All last night at my old hospital, counting to 27. over and over. That's why they transferred me. The counting was driving everyone crazy. I felt my blood run cold. When did it start? 3 weeks ago, he said. November 15th. Right at 11:11 in the morning, strangest thing, the nurses said they'd never heard anything like it. I called the facility in Boston. They confirmed it. The counting had started the exact moment ours had stopped. The pattern hadn't been broken. It had just moved. And now I wonder, when you're listening to this, when you're lying in your bed in the dark, have you started counting yet? Your breaths, your heartbeats? The shadows in the corners of your room? Because once you reach 27, well, the cycle has to complete somewhere. Sweet dreams. And whatever you do, don't count the sounds in your walls tonight. Especially not at 11:11. Story number 3. The last voicemail my grandfather left me was 17 seconds long. I've listened to it maybe 100 times since he died last month, trying to make sense of what he said. His voice, usually steady as Montana bedrock, trembled like I'd never heard before. Sarah, honey, they're coming back for it. What we found in 68, God help us. We should have left it buried. Don't let them... The message cuts off there. Heart attack, the doctor said. Natural causes for an 87-year-old man. But I know better now, especially after what I found in his cabin outside Bannock. Before you think I'm just another grieving granddaughter spinning tales, let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how some old mining towns feel wrong? Not just abandoned, but like they're holding their breath. Waiting? Bannock, Montana is one of those places. And after reading my grandfather's journal, I understand why. Comment below if you've ever felt that inexplicable dread in an abandoned place. That feeling that you're not supposed to be there. Because what I'm about to tell you, it might change how you see those feelings. Now, let me tell you what really happened in Bannock. My name is Sarah Chen Williams, and 3 weeks ago, I inherited my grandfather's property near Bannock Ghost Town. Grandpa Joe had been one of the last working miners in Montana. Stubborn as they come, still panning for gold well into his 70s. The cabin sat 15 miles from the ghost town, tucked into a valley that tourists never found. The drive from Missoula took 6 hours. October in Montana means snow threatens but hasn't quite arrived. That in-between time when the world feels thin. My Honda Civic struggled up the dirt road, and twice I thought about turning back. But that voicemail kept playing in my head. What I didn't mention before is that the road itself seemed wrong. I've driven Montana back roads my whole life, but this one, the GPS kept losing signal, then regaining it, showing me in impossible locations. At one point, it claimed I was driving through the middle of Grasshopper Creek. At another, it placed me 3 miles underground. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered from childhood visits. Weathered logs, tin roof, smokestack standing cold and empty against the gray sky. But something felt different. The birds. There were no birds, no squirrels. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place. I should have noticed the other details then. The way my car's radio produced only static on every station. How my breath fogged in the October air, but the fog moved upward in perfect spirals, defying physics. The way shadows fell at wrong angles, as if the sun were shining from multiple positions at once. Inside, everything was neat. Too neat. Grandpa Joe wasn't a messy man, but this looked staged, like he'd prepared for someone to come looking. His journal sat dead center on the kitchen table, a yellow sticky note on top with my name written in his shaky handwriting. But there were other notes too, dozens of them, scattered throughout the cabin, all in different handwritings, though I was certain Grandpa had lived alone. Some were in languages I didn't recognize. Others were in English but used words that didn't exist, describing concepts that made my head hurt to contemplate. One note, pinned to the refrigerator, simply read, "The mathematics don't work here anymore. 2 plus 2 ooh? Check your work. Check again. Nothing adds up." I made coffee first, instant, because the old percolator looked like it hadn't been touched in months. Then I sat down and opened the journal. The first entry was dated June 15th, 1968. Tommy Briggs found something today. We were working the old Grasshopper Creek claim when his pickaxe broke through into a hollow. Thought it might be a natural cave at first, maybe an old shaft from the 1860s rush. But the walls, sweet Jesus, the walls were smooth, too smooth, like glass. I paused, sipping the bitter coffee. The taste was wrong too, not just bitter, but somehow angular. Sharp in dimensions that taste shouldn't have. Grandpa Joe had told me stories about his mining days, but never about this. Never about 1968. The next entry was 2 days later, but the handwriting was different. Subtly different. The same hand, but steadier, more confident. We widened the opening. Had to use dynamite, carefully. Whatever this chamber is, it's not natural, and it sure as hell wasn't made by miners. The walls are some kind of black stone I've never seen. Obsidian, maybe, but it doesn't reflect light right. It seems to absorb it. Tommy wanted to call the university folks, but Pete said we should explore it first, see if there's anything valuable. We're going back tomorrow with better lights. P.S. Why did I write that? I don't remember writing that. But it's my handwriting, isn't it? My phone buzzed. No signal. Typical for this far out. But the screen flickered strangely, showing static for just a moment before going dark. When it came back on, there was a text message from myself. Sent from my own number to my own number. Don't trust the journal. It lies. We all lie, eventually. I hadn't sent that message. The journal entries became more erratic after that. June 20th. We found the artifacts today. 7 of them, arranged in a circle in the center of the chamber. They look like, I don't know how to describe them. Geometric, but wrong. They hurt to look at directly, like your eyes can't quite focus. Pete picked one up, said it felt warm. Alive, almost. We each took one. Figured we'd research them, maybe sell them to a museum. Tommy took 2, greedy bastard. But when we got back to town, we agreed not to tell anyone yet. Not until we understood what we'd found. A new paragraph appeared in different ink, different handwriting. They're not just warm, they whisper. Not in any language, but you understand anyway. Mine keeps asking about the others, wants to know where its family is. Family? Do geometric impossibilities have families? Do they grieve? And below that, in Grandpa's original hand, I didn't write that. But the artifact is getting heavier. Or maybe I'm getting weaker. Hard to tell the difference anymore. I flipped through pages noting gaps and dates. Then, July 4th, 1968. Tommy's dead. Police say it was an accident. Fell down his basement stairs, but I saw his body at the funeral. Those marks on his neck. Fingers don't leave marks like that. Fingers can't. Pete's convinced it's connected to the artifacts. He buried his in his backyard, under the old oak. I'm keeping mine in the lockbox. Someone needs to document this. But who will document the documentarian? Who watches the watchers? Who dreams the dreamers? I'm losing myself, one thought at a time, and I don't know if the thoughts I'm losing are mine or theirs. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, dusk was falling, and the shadows from the pines stretched across the yard like reaching fingers. But the shadows were moving wrong, not following the sun's path, but reaching toward the cabin, toward me, as if drawn by some invisible force. I should have left then, driven back to civilization and forgotten about the whole thing. But you know how it is with family mysteries. You can't just walk away, especially when your car keys aren't where you left them, and your car won't start anyway, no matter how many times you turn the key. The lockbox was under the floorboards in the bedroom, exactly where Grandpa always hid valuables. The key was on his keychain, the one the hospital had given me with his personal effects. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was something that shouldn't exist. How do I describe it? Imagine a cube, but with too many angles. Like those optical illusions that hurt your brain, except this was real, solid, and about the size of a baseball. The material looked like metal, but felt organic, warm, just like Pete had written. And there was a sound. Not quite a hum, more like a whisper just below the range of hearing. But more than that, it had weight that defied physics. Not heavy exactly, but dense in ways that matter shouldn't be. When I held it, I could feel it affecting everything around it. The floorboards creaked differently. The air tasted of copper and ozone. My watch stopped, then started running backward. I set it on the table and kept reading. August 1968. Pete's gone. Not dead. Gone. His wife says he went for a walk 3 nights ago and never came back. The sheriff found his clothes by Grasshopper Creek, neatly folded. No sign of struggle, no footprints leading away. It's just me and Bill now. And Bill won't answer his phone. I went to Pete's house, dug up his artifact from under the oak tree. The hole was perfectly spherical, like someone had scooped out the earth with an ice cream scoop. But the dirt remembered being moved. It whispered about going down, down, down into darkness that thinks and thinks about coming up. September 1968. I saw them last night. Or maybe saw isn't the right word. Perceived? They exist in the spaces between seconds, in the corner of your eye. The artifacts call to them, I'm certain now. We opened something that should have stayed closed. But maybe it was already open. Maybe we just noticed it for the first time. How long have they been here, watching from the spaces we can't see, learning our shapes, our thoughts, our fears? October 1968. Bill's in the psychiatric hospital in Warm Springs. Won't stop screaming about the shapes that crawl. I visited him today. He didn't recognize me at first, then he grabbed my arm and whispered, "They're not invading, Joe. They're evacuating. Their world is ending, and ours is the lifeboat. But lifeboats have limits. What happens when we exceed capacity? I'm the last one. I've tried destroying the artifact. Fire doesn't touch it. Hammer blows just bounce off. It's getting stronger. Or maybe I'm getting weaker. I can feel them watching even now, but also protecting. They don't want me dead. They want me changed." The entries stopped for 2 years, then resumed in 1970. I thought I'd beaten it. Thought if I ignored it long enough, pretended it was just a rock, maybe it would become one. But they're patient. God, they're so patient. I see now what they want. The artifacts weren't treasures. They were anchors. 7 anchors to hold open a door. Tommy took 2. That's why he went first. The more you have, the stronger the connection. I understand the pattern now. The 7 points of connection. The geometry of invasion. Not invasion, immigration. They're refugees from a dying reality, and we're the only habitable dimension they can reach. But our physics can't support them. So they need anchors, translators, bridges built from human consciousness. My phone buzzed again. This time, the screen showed a text from an unknown number. "You found it." No, that wasn't possible. No signal out here, remember? Another text. "We've been waiting." A third, "Your grandfather was efficient. You'll be better." I grabbed the artifact, don't ask me why, and ran outside. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the world tilted. Not physically, dimensionally. I could see the forest from 7 different angles simultaneously. Past, present, and future overlapped like double-exposed photographs. The sun had set completely now, and the stars were coming out. But they looked wrong. Too many, moving in patterns that made my stomach turn. constellations that spelled out words in languages that predated human speech. That's when I heard it. Footsteps in the gravel driveway, slow, measured. But when I spun around, nobody was there, just footprints. But the footprints had too many toes, and they were filling themselves in, the gravel flowing like water to erase the evidence. Back inside, I locked the door and kept reading. The entries from the 70s and 80s were sparse, mostly normal life stuff. Grandpa got married, had kids, worked claims, but every October there would be a note. They came again last night. The artifact stays buried. But there were other notes too, in margins, written in different inks, different years, buried but not sleeping. They dream through stone and earth. The children feel them. All children do. They just learn not to talk about it. Then, 1995, Sarah visited today, my granddaughter. 5 years old and bright as a penny, she found the hiding spot. Kids always do. But when she touched the artifact, nothing happened. She said it was pretty and asked if she could have it when she was older. I told her maybe. Could it be that simple? Could it pass to her safely? Someone who doesn't know what it is, doesn't fear it? Later, she drew pictures while I wasn't looking. 7 circles arranged in a pattern I recognize. In the center, stick figures holding hands, but the stick figures have too many arms, too many eyes. She labeled it Sarah's New Friends. I burned the drawing, but I can still see it when I close my eyes. I remembered that visit, remembered the pretty rock Grandpa had shown me, but I didn't remember it looking like this, and I definitely didn't remember drawing pictures of interdimensional beings. But as I sat there, holding the artifact, images flashed through my mind, memories that weren't mine. Or were they? 7 beings of impossible beauty, reaching through the cracks in reality. Not to destroy, but to understand, to touch, to become part of something larger than themselves. And underneath it all, a growing certainty. I wasn't the first Sarah to hold this artifact. There had been others. Other granddaughters, other inheritances. How many generations had this cycle repeated? The journal's final entries were from just last month. September 2024, they're getting stronger. Or I'm getting older, weaker. Can't tell anymore. The others, the ones who have the other artifacts, they're reaching out. I can feel them. 3 are dead. Their artifacts are lost, but 3 others still have theirs. 1 in California, 1 in Wyoming, 1 in Canada. They're being drawn together, all of them, toward Bannock. I can see their dreams now, the keepers. Each one thinks they're the guardian, the protector, the last line of defense. But we're not guardians, we're cultivators, gardeners tending a crop we don't understand for a harvest we can't imagine. October 1st, I understand now. The 7 artifacts weren't meant to stay separated. The separation was driving them angry, desperate. They need to be reunited. But if all 7 come together again, the door opens fully. Permanently, I've spent 56 years keeping mine away from the others. But I'm tired. So tired. The mathematics are becoming clear. 7 points of reference. 7 angles of incidence. 7 locks that, when turned simultaneously, don't lock something out, they lock something in. Us. Here. In this reality. While they step through to theirs. October 7th. They spoke to me last night. Not in words. In images. Showed me what they are. Where they're from. The spaces between spaces. The dark between stars. They're not evil. Not exactly. They're just incompatible with our reality, our physics, our minds, but they're curious. So curious about us. They want to understand, to touch, to become. The problem is their touch unravels us. But maybe unraveling isn't death. Maybe it's transformation. Maybe it's evolution. Maybe it's the next step we've been unconsciously preparing for since we first looked up at the stars and wondered if we were alone. The last entry was dated the day he died. Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. The artifact is yours now. They agreed to leave me alone if I passed it on, passed the burden. You're stronger than me, smarter. Maybe you can find a way. But whatever you do, don't let them bring all 7 together. And if someone contacts you about the others, run. P.S. I lied. Don't run. You can't. None of us can. The pattern is too strong now, too established. 6 generations of my family have held this artifact. 6 generations of careful cultivation. You're not the inheritor, Sarah. You're the culmination. The final piece of a puzzle I've been building my entire life. I'm sorry, but someone had to choose. And I chose you. My phone rang. Out here, with no signal. The voice on the other end was wrong, like multiple people speaking in almost perfect unison. Sarah Chen Williams, you have the 5th artifact. Who is this? We are the keepers of the 2nd and 4th. The 7th keeper is driving to your location now. We must complete the circle. I hung up, grabbed the journal, the artifact, and my keys. But when I tried to start the car, the engine wouldn't turn over. Not because it was broken, because the keys were changing shape in my hands, metal flowing like water, forming new patterns, new purposes. When I opened the front door, a man stood on the porch. Tall, thin, wearing clothes that looked normal until you really looked. Then you realized the fabric moved wrong, shifted wrong. "Hello, Sarah," he said with too many voices. "I'm the 7th keeper. Or I was. Now I'm something more." I backed into the cabin. He followed, moving in stutters, like a film missing frames. "Don't be afraid," he said. "The transformation is beautiful. You'll understand soon, when all 7 are together. My grandfather said, 'Your grandfather was a careful man. He thought keeping them apart would save us. But separation drove them mad, made them desperate, violent. Together, they're calm. Purposeful.'" He pulled out an artifact from his coat. Like mine, but different, more angles, if that was possible. The moment it came near mine, both started to pulse with a light that wasn't quite light. "Feel it," he whispered. "They're singing." He was right, I could hear it now, or feel it, a harmony that made my teeth ache and my eyes water, but also beautiful, terrifyingly beautiful. The song of something vast and ancient and utterly alien, reaching across impossible distances to touch our small, fragile reality. I ran, not outside, he was blocking the door, but deeper into the cabin, into Grandpa's old workshop. Slammed the door, locked it, shoved a workbench against it. The 7th keeper didn't try to break in. He just stood outside and talked in his chorus of voices. "The others are coming, Sarah. 2 hours, maybe 3. We'll have 5 of the 7, enough to open a crack, enough for them to start coming through. You can join us willingly. Or not, but you can't stop it." I looked around the workshop. Tools, old mining equipment, and explosives. Grandpa always kept dynamite for his claims, probably expired, but... "Sarah," the keeper called. "Let me show you something." Under the door, shadows began to creep. Not normal shadows. These had substance, texture. They wrapped around my ankles like cold silk, and suddenly I could see the spaces between, the vast dark where they lived. Beings of impossible geometry, beautiful and terrible, pressing against the thin walls of our reality, wanting in, not to destroy, but to explore, to experience, to become part of our world, even if our world couldn't survive their presence. I saw the truth. They weren't invaders. They were refugees. Their reality was dying, collapsing in on itself like a deflating balloon. The artifacts were their last hope. 7 anchors to hold open a door to a new home, but I also saw what would happen if they came through. Reality would bend, break, reshape itself to accommodate them. Humans might survive, but we wouldn't be human anymore. We'd be like the 7th keeper, multiple beings sharing one body, one mind, scattered across dimensions. The vision ended. I was gasping on the floor of the workshop. "Now you understand," the keeper said. "It's not about stopping them. It's about choosing how we change." I looked at the artifact in my hand, looked at the dynamite, made my choice. "You're right," I called out. "We can't stop them, but we can control how they enter." I opened the door. The keeper smiled with too many mouths. "Give me your artifact," I said. "I know what my grandfather didn't. The 7 need to be combined properly, in the right order, the right configuration. Do it wrong, and both realities collapse." It was a lie, but a convincing one. He handed me his artifact. The moment they touched, the world exploded into impossible colors. I could feel the door cracking open, feel them pressing through, but also feel their desperation, their need. "The others," I gasped. "We need the others." "They're coming," he assured me. 20 minutes now. 20 minutes. I had 20 minutes to figure out how to save the world, or at least our version of it. I did the only thing I could think of. I took both artifacts and ran to my car. Somehow, the engine started now. The keeper followed, but slowly, like moving through thick air. The artifacts were affecting him more than me. Maybe because I was blood related to a keeper. Maybe because I was younger. I didn't know. I drove toward Bannock, toward the ghost town, toward the place where it all started. Behind me, headlights. The other keepers, coming fast. The artifacts in my passenger seat were screaming now, a sound that made my nose bleed, but also showing me things. The chamber where they were found, the ritual that created them, not by the beings from between, but by humans. Ancient humans who found a crack between worlds and tried to seal it. The artifacts weren't anchors to open a door. They were locks to keep it closed. But locks can be picked, especially from the inside. I reached Bannock just as the other cars caught up. The ghost town stood empty under the stars, buildings like skeleton bones in the moonlight. But as I ran toward Grasshopper Creek, I realized the town wasn't quite as empty as it appeared. Figures moved in the windows of abandoned buildings, shadows that walked upright, echoes of people who had died here, pulled back by the growing weakness in reality's walls. The original chamber was exactly where Grandpa's journal described. The entrance had been sealed with concrete, but the concrete was cracked now, melting from the inside. "Sarah!" one of the keepers called. "Don't go in there. It's not stable." But I had to, because I finally understood. The chamber wasn't just where they found the artifacts, it was where the door was, had always been. The artifacts hadn't opened it, removing them had. For 56 years the door had been slowly opening, and the beings had been slowly seeping through, affecting anyone who held an artifact, changing them, preparing them. Inside the chamber, the walls of black glass reflected things that weren't there, or were there but shouldn't be. In the center, where the artifacts had been arranged, was a hole, not in the floor, in reality itself. And from that hole they were coming. I placed both artifacts back in their original positions. The screaming stopped. The hole began to shrink. The other keepers stumbled in behind me. "What are you doing?" they demanded. "What my grandfather should have done," I said. "Returning them." They rushed forward with their artifacts. 3 more, 5 of 7. As each one clicked into place, the hole contracted more. But also, The beings on the other side grew more desperate, more aggressive. One keeper held back, a woman, older, holding the sixth artifact. "We'll be trapping them," she said, "condemning them to die with their reality." "I know," I said. "But what's the alternative? Let our reality die instead." She looked at the hole, at the things pressing through, made her choice. Placed the sixth artifact, 6 of 7. The hole was barely a crack now, but through that crack, I could feel their rage, their despair, and their acceptance. One of them spoke, not in voices but in pure thought. "The 7th is lost, destroyed years ago. The seal will never be complete. We will seep through, slowly, drop by drop, until one day," the thought faded, but the threat remained. We stood in that chamber for hours, waiting, watching. As dawn broke, we made a pact. We would guard this place, take turns, make sure no one disturbed the 6 artifacts, make sure the crack didn't widen. But as I write this, 3 weeks later, I know it's not enough. The 7th artifact is out there somewhere. Maybe broken, maybe hidden, maybe in a museum labeled as something else. Without it, the seal will never hold completely. And they're patient, so very patient. I'm uploading this story because people need to know. Bannock isn't just a ghost town, it's a barrier, a thin spot between worlds that we're barely holding closed. So I need your help. If you've ever found something that looks impossible, something that hurts to look at directly, something warm and almost alive, please contact me. It might be nothing, but it might be the 7th artifact. And if you're ever in Montana, if you ever visit Bannock, and you feel that wrongness, that sense that something's watching from the spaces between, you're not imagining it. They're still there, still waiting, still seeping through drop by drop. The question isn't if they'll get through eventually. The question is, will we be ready when they do? Some nights, when I hold my piece of the 6th artifact, the small shard I kept, I can still hear them, and sometimes I wonder if my grandfather was wrong, if fighting them is futile, if becoming like the 7th keeper, multiple minds in one body, might not be so bad. The transformation is beginning. I can feel it. My thoughts aren't always my own anymore. And the worst part, I'm starting to like it. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, if you see something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, run. Or maybe don't. Maybe embrace it like I'm starting to. Tell me in the comments, what would you choose? Fight the inevitable or welcome the change? I'll be waiting for your answer. We'll all be waiting. Story number 4. Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you might save your life. Or, at the very least, it'll make you think twice before booking that perfect beach vacation you've been dreaming about. You know how they say some places are too good to be true? Well, Crescent Shore, Oregon, was exactly that kind of place. And I should have known better, I really should have. But before I tell you what happened that October, before I explain why I can't look at the ocean anymore without feeling my chest tighten, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear isn't some campfire tale. This happened. And somewhere out there, it's still happening. The story begins now. The rental listing had been perfect. Too perfect, maybe. But after 6 months of overtime at the Portland accounting firm, I wasn't asking questions. Just a cozy beach cottage in Crescent Shore, population 847, tucked away on the Oregon coast where the fog rolled in like clockwork every evening. The photos showed weathered gray shingles, a stone fireplace, and massive windows overlooking a pristine stretch of sand that seemed to go on forever. Sarah thought I was crazy going alone. "Jess, seriously? A beach town in October, in Oregon?" She'd wrinkled her nose over our Tuesday coffee, the same way she always did when she thought I was making a mistake. "Why not just, I don't know, go to Cabo like a normal person. But normal had never been my thing, and besides, there was something about that listing. Something in the way the afternoon light hit the water in those photos. Golden. Peaceful. Like the whole world had been put on pause. What I didn't know then was that some pauses last forever. The drive down took 4 hours. 4 hours of winding coastal roads. Classic rock on the radio, and the kind of drizzle that makes you grateful for windshield wipers. I stopped once at a gas station in Lincoln City, grabbed a terrible cup of coffee and some beef jerky, and the kid behind the counter, couldn't have been more than 19, had given me this look when I mentioned Crescent Shore. "You sure that's where you're headed?" He'd counted my change slowly, deliberately, like he was buying time. "Yeah, why?" He'd shrugged, handed me my receipt. "Nothing, just October's a weird time to visit is all. Most folks know to stay away after September." I'd laughed it off. Small town people, always suspicious of outsiders, always trying to keep their little secrets to themselves. But now, sitting here in my apartment with all the lights on, I keep thinking about that kid's face, the way his eyes had darted to the window, the way he'd whispered, "Be careful," as I walked out the door. I should have listened. God, I should have listened. The cottage was exactly as advertised, maybe even better. The key was under a piece of driftwood by the door, just like the owner had said, and inside smelled like cedar and sea salt, the kind of smell that instantly makes you breathe deeper. I dumped my bags in the bedroom, opened every window despite the chill, and stood on the deck watching the sun break through the clouds. The beach was empty, completely, utterly empty. Not a single footprint in the sand. Not a bird. Not even a piece of trash. Just miles of pristine coastline and the rhythmic crash of waves that seemed almost musical, like they were keeping time to something I couldn't quite hear. But here's what I remember now, what I didn't notice then. The waves weren't random. They came in sets of 7. Always 7. 7 waves, then a pause, then 7 more. Like a heartbeat. Like breathing. Like something alive and patient and waiting. I made myself a cup of tea, Earl Grey with honey, and settled into the worn leather chair by the window with my book. But I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the water, to the way the waves seemed to pulse with their own light as the sun started to set, blue-green, then deeper, then almost black. That's when I saw the first one, a figure, walking along the waterline, slow, deliberate, like they were looking for something in the sand. From this distance, I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, just a dark silhouette against the dying light. They walked north for maybe 50 yards, then stopped, stood there for a long moment, perfectly still, facing the ocean. Then they walked into the water, not running, not diving, just walking. Steady, purposeful, like they were going to meet someone. The waves reached their knees, their waist, their chest. I stood up, my book falling to the floor, my heart suddenly hammering. Should I call someone? Should I run down there? But they kept walking. Even as the waves crashed over their head, even as they disappeared completely beneath the surface, I waited, counted to 10, 20, 30, scanned the water for any sign of them, a head bobbing up, arms flailing, anything, nothing. I realize now that I was counting wrong. I was counting seconds, but the ocean counts in years. I grabbed my phone, started to dial 911, then stopped. What would I say? I saw someone go swimming at dusk? They'd think I was crazy, or drunk, or both. I stood there for another 10 minutes, watching, waiting. The beach was empty again, like it had never happened. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I I saw that figure walking into the waves. The strange determination in their stride, the way they never looked back. Not once. But what haunted me most was the feeling that they weren't alone out there, that something had been waiting for them in the deep water. Something patient, something hungry. The next morning came gray and misty, the kind of Pacific Northwest morning that makes you want to stay in bed with coffee and a good podcast. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen. So I bundled up in my Columbia jacket, the thick one Sarah had bought me last Christmas, and headed down to the beach. The sand was cold under my feet, damp, and still, no footprints except my own. I walked to where I thought the person had entered the water, looked for any sign, clothing, shoes, anything left behind, nothing. But the sand felt wrong somehow. Too smooth, too perfect, like something had carefully erased every trace of what happened there. "You're up early." I jumped, spun around. An older man stood behind me, maybe 70, wearing a Yankees cap and a windbreaker that had seen better days. His face was weathered, deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp, alert. "Sorry," he said, not looking sorry at all. "Didn't mean to startle you. I'm Bill. I run the bait shop up the road." "Jess," I managed, my heart still racing. "I'm renting the Clearwater cottage for the week." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the ocean. "First time in Crescent Shore?" "Yeah, it's beautiful. That it is." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You see anything interesting last night?" The question hung between us. Loaded. Heavy. Like he already knew the answer. I thought I saw someone swimming, but it was getting dark, so... Bill's jaw tightened. "What time? Around 6:30? Maybe 7? He pulled out a small notebook from his pocket, weathered and water-stained, and made a note. "Third one this week," he muttered. "Third what?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, like he was trying to decide something. "How long you staying?" 5 more days. Might want to cut it short." Before I could ask what he meant, he was walking away, his boots leaving deep prints in the sand. But here's what made my blood run cold. When I looked back at where he'd been standing, there were no prints at all. The sand was smooth, unmarked, like he'd never been there. I called after him, but he didn't turn around, just raised one hand in a half-wave and kept going. I spent the rest of the morning in town, if you could call it a town. One main street, a diner called Rosie's, the bait shop, a tiny grocery store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. And everyone, watched me like I was some kind of exotic animal, but it wasn't just watching. It was like they were memorizing me, cataloging every detail, like they were already planning how to remember me after I was gone. At Rosie's, I ordered pancakes and tried to make conversation with the waitress, a woman named Deb with bright red lipstick and tired eyes. "So, lived here long?" I asked, going for casual. "All my life." She refilled my coffee without me asking. "You're in the Clearwater place?" It wasn't a question. "Yeah, how did you—" "Small town, we know everything." She paused, glanced around the mostly empty diner. "You planning on staying the whole week?" "That's the plan." She set the coffee pot down, leaned in slightly. "Plans change, especially in October." "Why does everyone keep saying that? What's wrong with October?" Deb straightened up, her professional smile sliding back into place like a mask. "Oh, nothing really. Just tourist season's over. Not much to do, that's all." But that wasn't all. I could see it in the way her hands trembled slightly as she wrote up my check, the way she avoided looking at the window that faced the ocean. And when I paid, when our fingers touched as she handed me the receipt, her skin was ice cold, corpse cold. I left a generous tip and hurried out, but not before I heard her whisper to the cook, "Another one choosing the hard way." That afternoon, I positioned myself at the cottage window with binoculars I'd found in a drawer. If it happened again, I'd be ready. I'd see everything, maybe even record it on my phone. 4 o'clock came, then 5. The beach remained empty. 6 o'clock, and the fog started rolling in, thick and gray like a living thing. 6:30. There. 2 figures this time, walking from opposite directions. They met at the waterline, stood facing each other for a moment, then turned toward the ocean. Together, in perfect synchronization. Through the binoculars, I could see their faces, or what should have been their faces. Blank, smooth, like someone had erased their features with an infinite eraser. But their mouths were moving, speaking words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Welcome home, come home, join us. I grabbed my phone, started recording, zooming in as much as I could. They walked into the waves just like the person from last night. Steady, purposeful, unstoppable. The fog swallowed them before they got waist deep, but I kept recording, kept watching. 5 minutes, 10, 15, they never came back out. I played the video back, frame by frame. The quality was grainy, the fog making everything soft and dreamlike. But I could see them. 2 people walking into the Pacific Ocean like they were going home. But in one frame, just one, right before the fog consumed them. They turned. Both of them turned and looked directly at the camera, directly at me, and smiled. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time the house creaked, every time the wind shifted, I sat bolt upright, convinced someone was at the door, or the window, or already inside. The worst part was the dreams. Even when I dozed, I dreamed of walking along an endless beach under a starless sky, walking toward something that waited in the waves, something that knew my name, something that had been calling me my whole life. I just hadn't been listening. At 3 a.m., I gave up, made myself instant coffee, the terrible kind that tastes like burnt rubber, and started searching online. Crescent Shore, Oregon disappearances. Crescent Shore mysterious deaths. Crescent Shore October. Nothing. Well, almost nothing. A few tourist blogs about the quaint coastal town, a historical society page about the founding in 1892, and one weird Reddit post from 3 years ago. Anyone else notice something off about Crescent Shore, Oregon? Went there last October for a photography trip. Locals kept warning me about the beach after dark. Saw some seriously weird stuff. People walking into the ocean fully clothed. Tried to help one guy, but he just kept walking like he couldn't hear me. When I grabbed his arm, it was ice-cold like touching a corpse. He looked at me, and his eyes were completely black. No whites, nothing, just black. I ran, packed up that night and never went back. Still have nightmares. The post had 2 comments, one calling the guy crazy, the other just 3 words. October brings them. I scrolled deeper, found archived news articles from decades past. Missing persons reports that all had one thing in common. They disappeared in October. Near water, always near water, but the articles were old, buried deep in digital archives. Like someone had worked very hard to make sure they'd be forgotten. I must have dozed off at the table because I woke to someone knocking. Loud, insistent, the morning sun was streaming through the windows, bright and almost violent after the gray days. I stumbled to the door, still groggy, and found Bill standing there with a paper bag. "Brought you some pastries from Rosie's," he said, inviting himself in. "Figured you might want some company." We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd fallen asleep, and he saw my laptop, the Reddit post still on the screen. His face went very still. "So, you know," he said quietly. "Know what? That people keep walking into the ocean? That everyone in this town acts like it's normal? That they're not people anymore." He said it so matter-of-factly. like he was telling me the weather. Not by the time they walk into those waves. I stared at him. What are you talking about? Bill pulled out his notebook again, flipped through pages and pages of dates and times. Started in 1947, October 12th. Fishing boat called the Marianne went down about 2 miles offshore. Storm came out of nowhere. 7 crew members, all presumed dead. He paused, took a sip of coffee. Except they came back, October 12th, 1948, exactly 1 year later. Walked right out of the ocean at sunset, went home to their families. That's impossible. Is it? His eyes were intense, burning. Their families thought it was a miracle. For about a week, then they started noticing things. They were cold to the touch, always. Never ate, never slept. And their eyes, in certain light, weren't quite right. Too dark, too deep. Like looking into the ocean at night. They remembered everything about their old lives, Bill continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Every memory, every inside joke, every intimate moment. That's what made it so horrible. They were perfect copies. Except for one thing, they were patient in ways that living people never are. They could sit for hours without moving, without blinking, just waiting. Always waiting for October 31st. My coffee mug felt very heavy in my hands. What happened to them? October 31st, Halloween night. All 7 of them walked back into the ocean. Their families tried to stop them, but he shrugged. You can't stop someone who's already dead. This is insane. It gets worse. Bill flipped more pages. They came back the next year, October 12th, but this time they brought others with them. People who drowned, suicides, accidents, all walking out of the waves, all going home, all leaving again on Halloween. He looked up at me. It's been happening every October since. The town just learned to live with it. Why don't people leave? Why don't you call the police, the FBI, someone? Bill laughed, bitter and short. You think we haven't tried? Reporters came in the 60s. Their car was found at the bottom of a cliff. Government folks in the 70s. Boating accident. These days, we just keep quiet. Protect the tourists who don't know any better. Try to get them to leave before what? Before the ocean decides it wants them to. Here's what you need to understand, Bill said, leaning forward. The ocean here. It's not like other places. It remembers. Every soul it's ever claimed, they're all still down there, waiting. And every October, they get homesick. They come back to visit, to remember what it felt like to breathe air, to walk on dry land. But they can never stay. The ocean calls them back. Always. I thought about the figure from the first night, the 2 from yesterday. Those people I saw, probably been dead for years, coming back for their annual visit. Most of them stay away from the living. Just walk the beach, remember what it was like. But sometimes, he hesitated. Sometimes they get lonely, start calling to others, through dreams mostly. Sometimes voices in the waves. And if you're not careful, if you listen too long, you join them. He nodded. We've lost 3 locals already this month. Good people, strong people. But October's almost over. And the ocean, it gets hungrier toward the end. It needs 7 new ones every year, Bill added grimly. Always 7. That quota's the rule, the quota, and it doesn't matter if you're ready or not. If you're one of the chosen, you'll hear the call. And when you do, God help you, because no one else can. I should have left. Packed my bags that minute and driven back to Portland. Back to my normal life with spreadsheets and coffee runs and Sarah's eye rolls. But something kept me there. Maybe it was stupidity. Maybe it was that dangerous curiosity that's gotten humans in trouble since the beginning of time. Or maybe it was already too late. Because that's the thing about the ocean's call. You don't just hear it with your ears, you feel it in your bones, in your blood. Like a tide pulling at something deep inside you that you didn't even know was there. That night, October 30th, I heard them. Voices in the waves. Soft at first, like whispers carried on the wind. Then clearer. Voices I recognized. My grandmother, who died when I was 12. My college roommate, who'd overdosed junior year. Even my own voice, calling from somewhere far away. Come home, Jess. Come home to the water. But there were other voices too. Thousands of them. Men and women and children. All calling my name, all promising peace, promising an end to worry and pain and loneliness, promising forever. I stood on the deck, my hands gripping the railing so tight my knuckles went white. The beach wasn't empty anymore. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all walking slowly along the shore, their forms shifting and blurring in the moonlight. Some looked almost normal. Others were clearly wrong. Too tall, too twisted. Like the ocean had remade them into something else. One stopped directly in front of the cottage. Looked up. Even from this distance, I could see its eyes. Black, endless, like Bill had said. Like looking into the ocean at night. It raised one hand, beckoned. And God help me. I wanted to go. The wanting was physical, like hunger but deeper. Like thirst, but more desperate. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to walk down those stairs, to join them, to finally, go home. My feet moved without my permission. One step, two, I was at the stairs leading down to the beach before my phone rang. Sharp and sudden in the silence, Sarah's ringtone. The stupid song from that movie we'd watched 100 times in college. Jess, are you okay? I've been having the worst dreams about you. You're at a beach and there's something in the water and... Sarah? My voice came out cracked, desperate. Keep talking, please. Just keep talking. What? Jess, you're scaring me. What's going on? I backed away from the stairs, back into the cottage, slammed the door and locked it. I can't explain, just tell me about your day. Your boring, normal day, please. So she did. Talked about her commute, her annoying coworker, the new coffee place that opened downtown. Normal things, real things, living things. I pressed the phone to my ear like a lifeline, curled up in the leather chair, and watched the beach through the window. They were all looking at the cottage now, all of them, standing perfectly still, waiting. But as Sarah talked, as her voice filled my head with blessed mundane reality, I noticed something else. The figures on the beach were fading, not leaving, fading, like the connection to the living world was weakening their hold on this one. Jess, are you still there? Yeah, I'm here. Sarah, I'm leaving first thing in the morning. Okay, I'm coming home. Good, this place, whatever it is, it's not right. I can feel it even from here. She stayed on the phone with me until dawn, until the beach was empty again, until I could breathe without feeling like I was drowning on dry land. I packed in 10 minutes, threw everything in my car without bothering to fold or organize. But when I went to leave, Bill was standing by my car. Cutting it close, he said. I'm leaving. Right now. He nodded, but didn't move. Need to tell you something first, about tonight. Halloween night. I don't want to know. But you need to. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, handed it to me. That's a list. Everyone who's walked into the waves since 1947. Everyone who comes back. I didn't want to look, but I did. Names and dates going back decades. And there, near the bottom, 3 names from this week, October 27th, October 28th, October 29th. There's a pattern, Bill said. They always take 7. Every Halloween, 7 new ones join them. It's been 6 so far this year. So they need one more, tonight, and you've been watching them, listening to them. You're already connected. He looked genuinely sad. I'm sorry, I tried to warn you, we all did. I crushed the paper in my fist. No, I'm leaving. They can't make me. They don't have to make you, that's the thing. By midnight tonight, no matter where you are, you'll hear them. And you'll want to answer. You'll want it more than anything you've ever wanted in your life. You're crazy. This whole town is crazy. But even as I said it, I could feel it. A pull. Faint, but insistent. Like gravity, but sideways. Toward the ocean. There's one way, Bill said quietly. One person. In all these years, who heard the call and didn't answer? How? She never stopped moving. Drove all night. Every Halloween for the rest of her life. She drove. Coast to coast sometimes. Never stopping near water. Never stopping at all until November 1st. He paused. She died 5 years ago, natural causes, in her sleep. On November 2nd. She beat them. I got in my car, started the engine. What was her name? Bill smiled. Sad and knowing. Sarah Williams. Your grandmother. The paper in my hand had her name. October 31st, 1962. Crossed out. She left you something, Bill added, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. My name written on it in my grandmother's careful cursive. She said, if anyone in the family ever came here, if they heard the call, give them this. I tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was a single page. Her handwriting. My dearest Jess, if you're reading this, then you know. The ocean remembers everything. But so do we. Drive, sweetheart. Drive until the sun comes up. Drive until you can't hear them anymore. Drive until you remember that the living world is stronger than the dead one. And remember this, they can only call you home if you forget where home really is. All my love, Grandma Sarah, P.S. The salt helps. Keep it with you always. At the bottom was a small packet of sea salt. I clutched it tight. I drove fast, without looking back, but I could feel them behind me, following, waiting. And as the sun sets now, as I write this from a truck stop in Nevada, as far from the ocean as I could get, I can hear them starting, the voices in the waves, even here, even now. But I also hear other things. Sarah's voice, living voices, the sound of traffic and laughter and all the messy, beautiful chaos of a world where people are alive and imperfect and real. It's 11:47 p.m. on Halloween night. 13 minutes left. I'm going to get back in my car, I'm going to drive, and I'm going to hope, pray, that whatever my grandmother found the strength to do, I can do it too. But if you're reading this, if somehow this ends up online, and if you ever find yourself in a small coastal town in October, and the locals tell you to leave, listen to them. Because some places the ocean doesn't give back what it takes. It just takes more, and more, and more. The sound of waves crashing. Faint, but getting louder. I have to go, I have to drive, I have to... They're here. Even in the desert, they're here. And they're so beautiful, so peaceful. Like going to sleep, like going home, like... No. I'm holding the salt, I'm thinking of Sarah. I'm thinking of coffee shops and spreadsheets and all the boring, wonderful things that make life real. I'm remembering that home isn't the ocean. Home is where people know your name and worry about you and stay on the phone until dawn. I'm driving. I'm surviving. Just like Grandma did. Just like... Recording ends. Wait before you scroll away. Before you dismiss this as just another story. I need you to know something. I made it, barely. But I made it. It's November 1st now. And the voices are gone. The pull is gone. But every October, every single October, I drive. coast to coast, never stopping, never looking at the ocean. And here's what I learned. The ocean doesn't just want the dead, it wants the stories too. It wants people to forget, to dismiss, to explain away. Because the moment you stop believing, the moment you think it's just a story, that's when you stop listening for the warning signs. That's when you book that perfect beach vacation in October. And if you've made it this far, if you've listened to this whole thing, check the comments. Because I bet some of you have heard them too. The voices in the waves, in lakes, in rivers, even in the rain sometimes. We don't talk about it, we don't admit it. But we know, don't we? We know what's out there, waiting, calling. We know because somewhere, deep down, we can feel it. The pull of the deep, the promise of peace, the whisper that says, maybe, just maybe, drowning wouldn't be so bad. And we know that someday, maybe not this October, maybe not the next, but someday, the ocean always gets what it wants. Sweet dreams. And whatever you do, don't listen to the waves tonight. Don't ever listen to the waves. Because they're not just calling the dead anymore. They're calling you